All right, thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm really excited to talk about this really relevant and important topic of the connection between voting and clean water. Um, Before we get started, just want to introduce the groups that are working on this presentation for you this afternoon. First is the Choose Clean Water Coalition. We've been focused on elections-focused civic engagement. Really started it in gusto in 2020, and are excited to take up the mantle and continue it this year. And happy to partner with our sister coalition, the Coalition for the Delaware River Watershed, and excited to have a member of both of our coalitions, the Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania, present this afternoon a lot of really relevant and again important topics. Alan, can you go to the next slide, please? So before we dive into the meat of the presentation, just wanted to highlight two quick resources, and I'll drop them into the chat here in just a second. But the first is our Civic Engagement Toolkit. You might have heard of this before, but it's a really robust resource that both our coalitions have combined forces to address, and it's full of a lot of great resources that some of which you'll see in this presentation shortly. But it's something that we're constantly updating to include the most relevant and timely information. And yeah, it's just a great tool for you and your organization. And the second piece is this Vote for Clean Water cohort. Don't worry, I am not encouraging you to sign up for another committee or another call, but it's a way to express your interest in wanting to engage more in this work. We'll reach out with some custom resources and provide some custom opportunities for different things that you can do in the civic engagement space this fall. But with that, I'm happy to introduce our two presenters. First is Alan Madison. Alan might be familiar to some of you. He and Kristen presented at our 2021 virtual conference. So glad to see them again. Alan's a lawyer in Washington, D.C., a partner at Trister, Ross, Skadler, and Gold, and he represents nonprofit organizations on all aspects of their work. And he has some familiar background with that, having worked at the Sierra Club as their national media director. And he's going to really be instrumental in helping us this morning identify those lines between what's 501c3 friendly and what's not, which is a really important foundation to have when tackling this work. We're also going to hear from Kristen Zelkowski, who is the Director of Digital Engagement for Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania, and she works with CVPA's membership in taking action on key state and federal legislation and holding lawmakers accountable. She also leads, and this is a mouthful, the Delaware River Watershed Mobilization and Partner Capacity Building Program. But that's really helpful in helping dozens of watershed organizations in the Delaware grow their lists and amplify their priorities and improve their social media presence. And we'll see certainly some evidence of that in their presentation this afternoon. So with that, I'm gonna throw it over to Alan and Kristen.
Thanks so much, Drew. You can go to the next slide. Awesome. Well, hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. So I'm Kristen Zolkowski, the Digital Director for Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania. So in case you're not familiar with our organization, we're primarily a 501c4, and one of our main goals is to build the political power of the environmental movement. So we have far more elected officials at all levels of state government who want to make our issues their issues, so that we can have the policies that we need to have clean water, clean air, access to open spaces, and a livable climate for everyone. And we use our organizational structure along with a PAC and super PAC primarily to elect pro-environment candidates at the state and local level, to lobby our elected officials to vote for our priorities and against dangerous legislation, and hold our elected officials accountable for their votes using tools like our scorecard. So all that being said, 501c4s can do the same work as a 501c3 organization, and 501c4s and C3s can absolutely work together. If you go to the next slide, I wanted to just take a moment and talk a little bit about what the connection is between clean water and voting. So I think a lot of us know that our democracy works best when the people in elected office truly represent the will of their constituents. But as we've all seen lately, our democracy is under tremendous threat, maybe like never before. And we are seeing corporations and politicians take extreme actions to make it harder for certain populations to vote, so that these officials and the corporations can keep the power and pass laws that benefit them, even if those policies are not supported by the majority of people. That's why we're seeing policies that are wildly popular get blocked in Congress. So increasing voter turnout is really the key to a healthy democracy, because it means that our laws reflect the values of the majority of people. And if people disagree with what their lawmakers are doing, they have the power to vote them out of office. That's how our system works. So that means when we can get more people who support clean water to vote, there's a much better chance that we're going to elect lawmakers who value clean water as well. Now, 501c3s are unique in that they're allowed to take action on activities to strengthen our democracy, which includes getting more people voting. So 501c3s, like many of you here, hold tremendous power in their ability to communicate about elections, which can have ultimately a huge impact on policies that get passed about water. But there's also a lot that 501c3s can't do when it comes to elections. So now I'm going to turn it over to Alan to talk about all of those details now. So Alan, take it away.
Well, thanks so much, Kristen. I really appreciate it. And one message out to everyone who's listening is, as questions arise, we have the chat box open. So please feel free to put any questions in the chat box. I guarantee if there's a question or an issue that's confusing to you, all of the other folks on the call will really appreciate it if you ask it. They're probably just too shy to raise their hand and ask it. So either raise your hand and ask it verbally, or just put it in the chat box, and we'll get to all those questions, because it's complicated stuff, and I apologize if anything I say is confusing, but please, please, please do ask questions to check on exactly what your understanding of these issues is. So as Kristen mentioned, 501c3 public charities play a really important role in strengthening democracy. So they're doing everything from registering voters to reminding people when voting days are, talking about public issues, talking about clean water, all of the things that you do as a C3 throughout the year, you should continue doing during election season, keeping in mind what the rules are. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The basic rule is twofold. On the one hand, C3s have a right to continue educating the public, including throughout the election season. At the same time, a 501c3 organization isn't allowed to show any bias or preference for particular candidates. So you can't endorse candidates. It can't run ads saying that this candidate is terrible and people should vote against that candidate. It's a relatively broad prohibition because the IRS doesn't want groups trying to do a wink and nod to get around this prohibition. They say you can't show any bias or preference. So it's not just about don't say vote for or vote against. You can't be helping candidates. But at the same time, we can continue our public education work. And so what we need to do is, during an election season, think through what are the rules about the elections and about candidates? How do we keep promoting democracy and pushing for clean water without supporting specific candidates or specific political parties? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So as a C3 organization, there's a panoply of different activities that you're allowed to engage in. We're going to talk through all sorts of these different activities today. We're going to talk about voter registration, educating voters, get out the vote activities. You might hear the acronym GOTV, that's get out the vote activities. These are all fine for a C3 to engage in as long as it's doing it in a nonpartisan way, as long as you're not benefiting particular candidates or particular parties with your voter registration activities. You can even target these voter registration or get out the vote activities at particular demographic groups if those demographic groups historically have been underrepresented in the voting process. And that's something we're going to get into a little bit later. We're going to talk about how to educate candidates on our issues. And that's, I think, critically important and overlooked. We're going to talk about doing debates and forums, and also the role that ballot measures play in elections. The two things I want to just sort of mention right now, setting the scene, is your organization doesn't have to do, and probably won't do, all of these activities. It's important to understand what is within your organization's risk tolerance. Some organizations are going to do a lot of these election activities. Some organizations, your board of directors or maybe the executive director, is more skittish, and you have to work on getting the board to be comfortable with doing these things that are perfectly allowable for C3s. The way that I like to think of it is something that my kid's summer camp director once said, and you know, it's a summer camp over in Waynesboro, Pennsylvania. So what the director once said is that his job isn't to get kids and campers in particular, not to get kids outside of their comfort zone. His job, and the job of a camp, is to expand their comfort zone. And so that's what I really want you to think about today during this. How do we just expand your organization's comfort zone to be comfortable with engaging in these election year activities? So, you know, think about it in baby steps. What are the next couple of small steps your organization could take to be engaged in elections without trying to take a giant leap into something new? Just taking baby steps to keep expanding your comfort zone here. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is nonpartisan voter outreach. So the things that we're going to talk about in terms of nonpartisan GOTV, and also voter registration, is that we're allowed to broadly push for public outreach, you know, not targeted. This is, if you want to think about it, this is setting up a table outside of Giant Eagle, or this is setting up a table at a community event and providing information to anyone who walks by. Totally allowable. And one thing to think about here is to divide. I want to, as we talk about this, to divide voter registration and get out the vote activities. And I think I should probably define those. Voter registration activities is, by that I mean activities to encourage people to register to vote. Now, Pennsylvania in particular, but every state, has very specific laws about voter registration drives, about how to conduct them, about when the voter registration cards need to be turned in, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're an organization that's new to getting involved in elections, doing a voter registration drive might be more than you're interested in taking on because of all of those specific rules that are involved with doing a voter registration drive. That's totally fine. For an organization like that, think though about nonpartisan get out the vote. Nonpartisan GOTV doesn't involve any registration. You're not having to collect registration cards or turn them in. You're simply informing people, hey, voting is really important. These are the dates. This is when election day is. This is when polls are going to be open. Early voting starts on this day. That sort of activity is a lot easier to conduct and requires a lot less compliance and a lot less legal risk than doing voter registration activities. So think about that. If you're not an organization that's ready to conduct voter registration, that nonpartisan GOTV and education is really important. And so for both voter reg and for get out the vote activities, you can target it broadly to the public, do public outreach. Another is you can target to historically underrepresented populations, as I mentioned. So this is an effort where the IRS is saying that 501c3 organizations have an important role to play in overcoming historic or systemic discrimination or other barriers that have prevented groups from voting at the overall population rate. So this would include Black voters, young voters, women, could be some subsets like single women, or, you know, Latinas. So you can divide amongst these underrepresented populations to target them very specifically. What we can't do, though, is add an issue screen. So we can target people based on the status of being historically underrepresented, but we can't say, okay, we're going to target historically underrepresented people who agree with our issues. And the reason we can't do an issue screen saying we're going to only target people who care about clean water or people who call themselves an environmentalist or what have you, is because that's going to tend to have more of an alignment with how people vote. So we can target women because they have historically been discriminated against or historically have voted at lower rates, but we can't target environmental women because that's going to have an impact on the election. So we have to leave off those screens for partisanship and also those screens for their issue preference. Importantly, when we're writing our script, this is the last bullet on the screen, we can't have a script that acts as a screen. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is if you go to a door, you can't say, hi, do you care about stopping climate change? And then later on in the script say, oh, are you registered to vote? Would you like to register right now? Because the effect of that order of the conversation is that the people who don't care about climate change are going to slam the door in your face. So the only people who are going to hear that message about getting registered to vote or the nonpartisan GOTV message that you have, those are only going to be people who care about climate change. So the order of the script in that situation serves as a screen. But if we flip it around, let's say you go to a door and say, hey, would you like to register to vote? Or, hey, did you know about the election? It's on November 8th. And then after you get through all of the election-related content of your script, if you then get into a discussion and say, hey, now that you've registered, we're so excited that you registered, what about climate change? Would you like to get into, learn more about climate change? Would you like to get onto our mailing list? That's going to be a totally fine activity to do because you've already delivered the election information. So it's not going to serve as an issue screen for that person. So Tricia has a great question here, which is, can you screen underrepresented populations and environmental justice areas? They commonly go hand in hand. So Tricia, why don't you come off of, do you mean, if you can come off of mute, do you mean, can you target Black voters in areas that have an environmental justice issue going on? Is that what you mean essentially?
Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's basically the question is, I mean, a lot of historically underrepresented populations also have EJ, live in an EJ area based on maps that are created by Pennsylvania and other states and have environmental issues going on. So it's not that you're really targeting them because they only care about environmental issues, but because they are also in an environmental justice area given where they live.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a really savvy question because essentially you're in that situation, the geography, one can think of it as screening for EJ for issues. The people in that geography probably care more about that particular issue. The IRS isn't going to look at that because people in that area, people in that geography care about all sorts of issues. Some of them may have a heightened interest in environmental issues, but the fact that they live in that particular geography doesn't necessarily predispose them to voting, to caring about a particular issue. It's an interesting and savvy question to ask. And in fact, you can extrapolate it a little bit. So, so Tricia's question is a super sophisticated version of this, which is most, Black women tend to vote predominantly for Democrats. Doesn't targeting Black women itself serve as a partisan influence? Or people who live in Philly are more likely to vote for Democrats than people who live elsewhere. If you do if you're targeting the general public in Philly, doesn't that serve to have a Democratic lean? If you're doing a tabling event outside libraries in Philly, aren't you mostly going to be registering people who tend to be Democrats? Yeah, that is a likely outcome, but the rule that takes precedence here from the IRS is that you're allowed to target Black women. The fact that they may overwhelmingly vote for one party is irrelevant. Women and Black voters have faced systemic and historic discrimination, and so a C3 is allowed to overcome that. So those are sort of the broad rules of geography and demography. And then Trisha's honing in a little bit more on this EJ question. But in all of these cases, we're allowed to be targeting based on these criteria, as long as we're not just targeting environmental justice advocates or something like that. Sorry, let me just close the screen on Trisha's question there. So does anyone have any other questions about targeting before we move on to messaging? And some of these things will wind up being intertwined, obviously. So on the messaging, this sort of builds off of what we were just talking about previously. You're allowed to talk broadly about issues when we're doing messaging about nonpartisan get out the vote activities or nonpartisan voter registration. We're allowed to talk broadly about issues as long as it doesn't define or align in a particular way with specific candidates. So we can talk, for example, the American Electoral Society says, vote because of healthy families, clean water, scientific research. These are all issues, broad issues that local elected officials are going to have power over. And so they're saying, do something productive, register to vote, and vote for healthy families, clean water, and scientific research. Now, no politician opposes healthy families. So saying healthy families doesn't align with any particular candidate, unless, of course, that happens to be a candidate's particular slogan. But let's assume that there's no candidate with a particular slogan of healthy families. Clean water and money for scientific research may tend generally to align with particular candidates in a race, but it would really depend on that race, whether there's one candidate who's, if clean water is a particular issue in that race, and it's clear that your messaging is aligning with a particular candidate. Here, the American Electoral Society isn't clearly aligning with any particular candidate. So this is a broad, perfectly permissible C3 message. And in those messages, you can provide, here they've got a link to register to vote, so that ALS isn't handling the voter registration themselves, but they're saying, click this link and you can learn where to register to vote. That's a great way to get information out to people. You can provide information, as I mentioned, about dates of when early voting happens, when voter registrations need to be submitted and things like that. As long as we're not doing the activity in a way that's going to clearly favor a particular candidate, right? So we can't use #MAGA in your C3 voter registration activity materials, because that's going to be aligned with particular candidates. So I want to give an example of what we were just talking about. And this is from down in North Carolina. The North Carolina League of Conservation Voters Foundation put out, this was a door hanger that they were hanging on people's doors as they were going door to door, doing just straight up C3 voter education activities. As you see, the door hanger says early voting is October 18th to November 3rd at 1 o'clock. There are different places, different ways to do it. Here's information to learn about requesting an absentee ballot or where polling places are open at ncvoterinfo.org. And they talk about issues. I'll blow it up so it's easier to read. The issues that they talk about on this door hanger are economic opportunity through good jobs, clean air for healthy communities, and affordable access to clean energy, right? This is C3, broadly C3 permissible, because it doesn't distinguish between particular candidates. It's not so specific that it's going to align with any one particular candidate, but it generally talks about things that all candidates talk about. What problems do people see with this? Anyone think that this is maybe problematic for a C3 to do, or what would you have done with your organization, do you think, to make this a safer communication? Anyone want to put their thoughts up in either in the chat or just come off of mute? How could this have been either safer or more aggressive? Well, it focuses very specifically on environmental issues. The economic opportunity through good jobs we included to broaden it out. And you could also talk about economic clean energy jobs, things like that. Clean air for healthy communities is relatively broad, but somewhat specific. There were some clean air debates between candidates in North Carolina that were going on that could have resulted in this honing in on one candidate or another. And clean energy wasn't something that is entirely broadly accepted. So there are certainly ways to broaden this out even more if they talked about economic opportunities through good jobs, clean air for healthy communities, and good schools for all children. Certainly there are no candidates who oppose good schools for all children. So you can make this as broad as you want, to be as safe as you want, so that you can encompass all candidates, or you can choose issues that are more closely focused on clean water, but you have to recognize that there might be some trade-offs depending on what's going on in particular elections in your state or in the area. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So let's talk about these two. Don't be shy and come off of, it's always more interesting when people come off of mute and then talk about questions. So first, we've got this one from the stream team. Vote by mail, safe, secure, convenient. The message here is, make your voice heard. Stay safe, stay home, vote by mail. This is such a super 2020 message, right? This is going to be, it's going to give us all flashbacks in the years to come, that this is such a clearly 2020 message. But what do you guys think about this? If people want to put ideas in the chat box, is this safe, aggressive, over the line?
Real quick, folks do have the ability to put something in the chat box, or if you'd rather come off mute, just send me a message and I can take you off of mute, and you can ask your question or share your thought.
So Kristen, you're the one who picked this one and included it. How come you included the stream team's example?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it felt, completely zero or point some small number risk. Talking about, sort of the vehicle of voting by mail, making your voice heard is all very pro-democracy, and then a vehicle to a government website pointing people to sign up to vote. And the graphic really reiterates that. So that felt very, very safe.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's an important point that you highlighted there, that you're driving people to the state's website for the voter information, for signing up for vote by mail. You're not driving them to a political candidate or political party's website, which would have been improper for a C3. So yeah, I would agree with you that the stream team's message here is completely safe. I don't know if you gave it, you said 0 point something% risk. Yeah, it's totally risk-free for a C3. Encourage people to vote, tell them how to vote, give them information. And when I say how to vote, obviously, I'm not saying, which candidate to vote for. I just mean, physically, how do you vote in this election? And in this way, they're saying, stay safe, stay home, vote by mail, and giving people a vehicle for it. Now, the water keepers, here we're retweeting. Is this a retweet or are these two separate ones?
Two separate ones.
Oh, okay. Let's talk about the water keepers one first. The water keepers here is an interesting, they're pushing out the deadlines in Virginia and Maryland for registration. They're encouraging people how to register, right? And what's the timing? They're including a hashtag that says vote for clean water. And that's the same message that the Broadhead Watershed Association is saying, is vote for clean water in November 3rd. Do people have any reactions to that message of vote for clean water? Does that seem completely safe, situational dependent? What do you guys think?
Well, I'm biased, but I certainly would argue that it's safe with clean water being the most one of, if not the most bipartisan issues out there. It's, I think it would be different if it was, vote to end fossil fuels or something that's certainly more partisan. But that said, Alan, you're the lawyer, so value your opinion there.
Well, so Drew, what if this election was, what if this was an organization in Flint, Michigan, where the message was vote for clean water? Does that change your analysis or no?
Well, I think it would certainly depend on the context of any given election. For us, we're, focusing our outreach on the Chesapeake Bay watershed and Delaware River watershed, so I think we're safe on that front. Generally speaking, I can't imagine anyone running for elected office that would be against clean water. So that's where I would come to the position that it's a safe thing to say.
Yeah, what you said there is really important, that it depends on the context, right? So in a situation like Flint, you do have candidates who have different positions specifically on clean water, where you've got some candidates, you've got candidates on a panoply of different positions up in Michigan, especially in Flint, but also dealing with things like Line 5, which is an underwater pipeline up there. And so in some of the areas in Michigan, vote for clean water would definitely have a partisan impact on it. So for example, one of the biggest things that Governor Whitmer is running on is clean water, and is putting out a clean water plan and is really embracing it and is getting flack for it, frankly. So there are places where vote for clean water is going to have a message that really does align more with particular candidates. If you're in a situation where, in like the Chesapeake Bay watershed, where it's a non-controversial issue, you're on a safer ground for saying vote for clean water as a C3. Now, I want to put this in sort of the legal framework, which is that folks in my firm have spoken with IRS agents about this, not about vote for clean water, about vote for kids, right? So I know everyone on this call thinks everybody supports clean water, but you also know, if you break it down, there are definitely politicians who aren't willing to stand up for clean water. So it's not the case, everyone says that they're for clean water, but it's not the case that everyone's plans are the same. Now, the IRS has said to us about the phrase vote for kids, that even vote for kids is a problem for C3s potentially. I would vociferously disagree, and I would fight back for any client who the IRS ever came at them and said, hey, you can't say vote for kids because it aligns with a particular candidate. All candidates are pro-kid, right? So the IRS's position is a pretty extreme one, that they think vote for kids aligns with particular candidates. And I'm sure that in any context you could defend vote for kids, but there are contexts where vote for clean water is going to have more or less of alignment with the candidate. So I'm not saying it's at all a problem, and I'm not saying that any of the outreach in 2020 is a problem. Simply keep in mind as you're coming up with messaging, just keep your antenna out for what's going on in the context. In particular races, it could well be that in Maryland or Virginia, vote for clean water is totally safe, but you wind up having some sort of an issue that arises in a Western Pennsylvania race where it winds up being a divisive issue. So it is important to keep that distinction in mind. Here's an example from Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania that's just a straight C3 GOTV message. Kristen, what is it about this message that makes it so impactful and so useful?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the approaches that we take is we try and get people the information they need so that they can basically psychologically like know when they can vote. And we also try and use a technique called like, I'm not going to describe it exactly right, but like planning to vote. So the paragraph where we talk about whether you vote first thing in the morning, during your lunch break, or on your way home from work, is important to set aside the time. And that's something that a lot of organizations have researched, that when you can get someone to think about like actually making their plan to vote, it's going to increase the likelihood that they actually follow through.
Yeah, and the great thing about this this CVPA project was if you click through, it has you physically check a box. I plan on voting in the morning, or I plan on voting at such and such a time. And it takes what Kristen just said, that the research shows that just having people think about their actual voting plan increases their likelihood to vote. And then the next step is having them write it down locks them in. So what CVPA did here is they had people write down their plan for when they would vote, and the system would send them back a message a few days before the election, before election day, or before early voting, and said, you've committed to vote on this day at this time. This was the plan that you made. And people don't want to break a promise to themselves. They want to believe to themselves that, hey, I said I was going to do this, and they're going to follow through with themselves on it. So this is an online version, but a lot of organizations, when they're tabling, will have a postcard. People write a postcard to their future self, reminding them, hey, I promised I would vote in the morning. I'm going to have to get, and it's tricky. I got to get my kid dropped off for daycare. I got to get to a meeting on time, so I'm going to vote before work. Or I know I'm going to need to line up childcare so that I can go vote. It's not just as easy for everybody just to say, oh, I'll just show up in the middle of my day. Having them make a plan, and then having them write down that plan, and then postcard to themselves or whatever it may be, a reminder on their fridge, that really makes a big impact in getting people to actually go ahead and vote. And that's the thing I want people not to lose sight of, right? Is all these groups go out there and they do voter registration work, which is important, and I'm not downplaying voter registration. But more important than getting people registered is making sure those who are registered actually cast their ballot. Every year there are all sorts of big pushes to get more people registered. But if we're not turning those registrations into actual ballots cast, democracy gets weakened. So your role as the C3 is to strengthen democracy by getting people to cast those ballots in whatever manner it is, whether it's make a plan to vote, or vote for clean water, or doing tabling and reminding people about how to get to the polls, or signing them up for rides to the polls. Kristen, you want to talk about the voter resources?
Yeah, so we wanted to share this example of, Alan talked about sort of the baby steps that you can take as an organization, and using your website is one of those areas that might represent a really effective and awesome baby step for your organization. This example is from our strategic partners at Penn Future. As we all know, they're a 501c3, and there's sort of a split screen. It's just a bunch of scrolling. So the top of the page is on the left, and the more downward pages at the right-hand side. But you can see all the information that they shared is all about the mechanics and logistics of voting. Again, when you decide what links to use, like we mentioned earlier, it's always safest to go with government websites. The state and has excellent websites about, checking the status of your registration and registering, finding your polling place, and, then looking up, there's a lot of different legislator lookups that are state or federal hosted. So you can see who's running. But what I really like about this approach, and it's interesting, our website does, we provide all the dates, but that means there's a lot of maintenance on our website when dates go by, and we have to update that every cycle. What I love about this, and where again, I think it's really doable, is that it's relatively static. Of course, like any website, you should go check through, make sure links still work and that kind of thing. We can't control other entities, websites, but now that this is up, it doesn't take a lot of maintenance throughout the election cycle. So I think this was a good one to share.
Yeah, thanks. That's great, Kristen. Another tactic I wanted to mention. Well, I guess last chance before we move on to candidate briefings. Any other questions about voter education and GOTV? Well, we will remain open for questions, so feel free to ask them. I wanted to mention educating the candidates. So we've talked about educating voters. Educating the candidates is a hugely important tool. And I've got a picture here of Senator McCain, but the more local you can do this on the smaller level, the more impactful it can be. And let me tell you why. Because if you're able to do candidate education with people who are just running for state house for the first time, for example, or people who are newly elected at their county level, they're thirsty for information, and you have the information about environmental issues. And so they're at a stage where they've never probably thought about environmental issues in their life, and certainly not policy issues to the degree necessary for running for elected office. So they're going to be really grateful to you for providing that information. And more importantly, they're going to turn to you as a long-term resource. Getting in when people are candidates enables you to establish your credibility with these folks who are leaders in the community, and you'll grow that relationship over the long haul. So if you have a meeting with Senator McCain, he's been in public life for 40 years at this point, right? He's not going to all of a sudden need to learn all that much more information about particular, or he already has environmental groups he's going to turn to. But if you're able to get in early with people who are running for office, you can establish a long-term credibility, a long-term relationship with that person, and provide them information for years and years. And in future, when they're having the chance to vote on legislation or chance to introduce new bills, they're going to come to you to ask for your guidance and your expertise. So candidate briefings is a really powerful tool, and I don't want people to shy away from doing it by thinking that any office is too small or too lowly to bother doing it. In order to do it in a C3 manner, we just need to make sure that we're educating all of the candidates. We're giving all of the candidates an opportunity to get educated about your issues. So what you do is provide information to all of the candidates for a particular office, so that you're giving them all the same availability. Now, they might not take you up on it, right? So what you do is typically we'll send out information about your issues, email it to the campaign manager or to the candidates themselves, and offer an in-person briefing. Say, hey, here's some basic information about this issue that we care about. We think it'll be relevant to your race. Wanted you to have it. If you'd like, we can bring in some experts and sit down with you for an hour to talk through these issues. Or Even better, we can take you out to do some clean water testing at streams. We can take you out to some wetlands that are particularly endangered in our community so that you can see firsthand the issues that are impacting our community. Get them out into a pair of waders so that they can see what's going on in particular wetlands. If some candidates say yes and some candidates say no, that's perfectly fine, right? We can't force people to have a meeting with us, but it gives people who want to learn an opportunity to learn more information. Now, I do have two caveats that I wanted to make clear here. The first is, and it's kind of ironic, when I say you've got to stop when you have success. What do I mean by stopping when you have success? If you're really doing a good job with candidate briefings, you're going to get this candidate excited about your issues. They're going to want you, they're going to say, hey, I would love to give a speech on clean water. I'd love to place an op-ed in the local newspaper about clean water. Can you write it for me? And that's when you have to stop. You can't write new materials for candidates. That would be helping the candidate. That would be impermissible C3 activity if you're providing an op-ed for a candidate to place in the newspaper. So we can't do that. So anticipate what success would look like. Anticipate what are those questions that a candidate will ask if they get really jazzed about our issue. They're going to want talking points or sample op-eds. So when you prepare your briefing packet, do so with an eye toward that long-term success, so that if a candidate gets excited and is going to say to you, hey, can you help me write an op-ed? You can say, look, because we're a C3 that doesn't support candidates, I can't write the op-ed for you. But the briefing packet that we sent includes all the information that you would need for your staff to be able to write an op-ed for themselves. And that can be a really powerful tool. So I just want people to think long-term about that success. The other is that we can't tell the media which candidates took us up on the offer to learn more or to have an in-person briefing. So for example, if you're going to be taking candidates out to do site visits to learn about particular streams, you can't invite the media along, or the candidate can't invite the media along with them, because then the media is going to start reporting on, oh, candidate, Maria Fernandez was really interested in these issues and signed up for more information, whereas the other candidates declined the invitation from conservation voters or from Penn Future or what have you, right? So we do have to be a little bit careful about that. And organizations, so that's sort of as you think through the baby steps of moving out, one could be inviting these candidates or sending briefing materials. Another is sending, and this is an example of some of those briefing materials that the organization Think 0 to 3 did with their Think Babies campaign. They gave basic information to all of the candidates on what a good child care policy would look like that would help infants and toddlers. And so you can think through, for your organization, what would it look like to include that information for candidates so that they could develop their own policy. So Holly asks, is it okay to report through your own channels about visits from representatives? So Holly, what do you mean? Tell me a little bit more about what you mean by your own channels. Do you want to just come off of mute or?
I guess I'm thinking, we have a blog and a website and social media. So, we always invite all representatives. I work for a foundation for a lake. But when they do come, there are times that we write a post or social media saying, so-and-so came out to the lake today kind of thing. Is that okay?
That's a great example. I'm really glad you asked that. It depends on when it is and whether it's in a context of the election or not. So right now, or right now, as we're close to the election, if you have particular candidates coming to do those site visits at the lake, you probably don't want to put it on your blog or put it out on social media to say that this particular candidate was interested in learning more issues. because that is going to give the appearance that you're saying this is a candidate who cares about our issues. Now, if you're talking to people, let's say it's somebody who's already a legislator, for example, I imagine that what you're doing is you're probably doing these site visits throughout the year and also in off years, in non-election years. If you're doing it farther out from the election than right now, let's say you're doing it in the middle of the spring before the election, or even better during an off year, if you're doing it during an odd numbered year and the person's not facing election, that's totally fine, because that's not publicizing information about them as a candidate. It's not trying to influence their election. Rather, you're just sharing information about what the elected officials are doing. And that's perfectly fine. As we said at the outset of this training, C3s retain their ability to talk about issues and throughout the year to engage in all sorts of advocacy around issues. And when you're saying, in February of an election year, or you're saying during an off year, hey, Representative Fernandez came and visited the lake and we showed her all of these different things. She was really interested in the wildlife. That's totally fine, because it's not in the context of an election. You're sharing it in the context of her official role.
Excellent, thank you.
Also wanted to mention just briefly candidate forums. And as we talk about sort of the baby steps, this is for organizations that are relatively sophisticated and comfortable with engaging in election issues. And so you can have a forum to educate the public about candidates and enable candidates to share their positions on issues, as long as you're making sure everybody, all the candidates for a given office, have access to it, right? Make it equally available to everyone. You can throw out those candidates who are so fringe that they don't have, they don't meet a viability threshold. You want it to be moderated by someone who's neutral, a local journalist, for example, so that there's no claim that the organization is imposing its own preferences on the forum. And most importantly, you need to talk about issues very broadly. You can't be having yes or no questions to say, hey, does this candidate align with our issues? Does this candidate, is this candidate willing to adopt the CVPA clean water agenda? That sort of thing, whether it's a yes or no question, or do you pledge to do X, Y, or Z in office? Those sort of things don't facilitate broad conversation about their position on the issues. It just says, hey, this is a candidate who aligns with our organization's positions. And if you're just saying that a candidate aligns with the organization's positions, that's a tacit endorsement of that candidate. So we really need to stay away from that. But it's easy to structure a candidate forum around environmental issues broadly, so you're not aligning with any particular organizational issue. And especially if it's a clean water debate, you want to be addressing all sorts of issues around environmental. You want to get into EJ, you want to get into stormwater waste management, you want to get into how climate change is going to impact things. You want to talk as broadly as you can, so it's not just simply, does this candidate agree that the number of parts per million in drinking water should be X or Y? Because that's going to seem more like, does this candidate support our issues? The last thing I wanted to mention just briefly is ballot measures. We've been talking all along about candidates, right? C3s cannot influence a candidate's election, but they're allowed to weigh in on ballot measures. It's lobbying, it's direct lobbying for a 501c3 to weigh in on a ballot measure. It's not grassroots, it's direct lobbying. And you might have to report your activity either as an in-kind contribution to the ballot measure committee, or you might have to file your own campaign finance reports, but it's perfectly allowable to engage on these on ballot measures. So I just want to make sure that we dispel any myths people might have or misconceptions about ballot measures.
Awesome. So as you head into fall, this is really the key time to engage your membership and start to expand your comfort. So we just wanted to recap some of the key moments to think about and hopefully to incorporate into your communications calendar. So, we've got, every state has a voter registration deadline. And that really also matters for people to check their voter registration status. If someone has moved or maybe changed their last name, they would need to change your registration. So that's a key date to put into your calendar. Encouraging your members to vote by mail or sign up to vote by mail. Every state's laws are a little bit different, right? So you want to think about what is that deadline? What does that entail? Some states have early voting. So that's something you can tell your members, voting starts on this day, and help them that way. Then there's, of course, voting on election days and helping folks to understand, getting them links to their polling places, helping them understand, the times that they can start and when the polls close are all key and pieces of information that you all can share out.
All right, can you go back real quick,
Sure.
Alan? So this slide might look familiar to you all, and I failed to drop the toolkit and cohort interest form links into the chat earlier, so I just did now. I'd recommend bookmarking that toolkit, as as what Kristen just covered, those different stages. We're gonna have new content coming up as each of those stages approach. So like right now, we don't have a lot of how to do mail-in voting posts because that's not relevant, and we don't want this to be a 50-page toolkit. But we are updating it frequently so that it's most timely and relevant. And then again, the cohort, you're not signing up for something very big, a major time commitment, just as a way for us to track who's interested in learning more and ways that we can, for individuals for us to contact, to provide some more custom outreach and resources. Next slide. I think this is yours, Alan.
Yeah, so I just wanted to wrap up. Kristen and I Drew will stay on a little bit after the call ends, after 1 o'clock arrives, if other folks have more questions. But the goal here is just to help get people to be more comfortable engaging in elections. My firm helped write the AFJ guide rules of the game. It will show your board from an outsider perspective. Yeah, this is totally allowable stuff. And also recognize that there's reason that your board's going to be concerned and might have questions about something that's new to them. And so we need to work with them to expand their own comfort zone with these issues. So don't be discouraged if you get questions from them initially or even some pushback. We can, over time, work with boards to make sure they understand this is an important issue for C3s to engage on. So with that, if there are any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And with that, have a great rest of your day.
Well, thanks, Alan and Kristen. That was great.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Drew. Yeah, thank you, Alan.